welcome to the festival webinar. As I said, I'm Liz Pugh, and I'm going to begin taking you through the steps around health and safety. So, the larger your festival, I think the more important health and safety is for you. But even for very small events, it's still a big consideration. What I want you to be able to do as a festival manager is identify the potential hazards and take steps that will protect you and your team wherever you're sitting, whether you are whether you're in Calabar or Port Harcourt or Lagos. Now, in the UK, we talk about health and safety. From the research that I did, in Nigeria, I think you refer to occupation, safety and health, so it's just that other way around. And those, in general, the legislation around health and safety, whatever country you're in, will apply to all businesses, whether you are a one-person festival making events happen, or whether you're, hold on, I'm just going to mute there. Whether you're a large festival attracting thousands of people. Obviously, the approach that you take needs to be proportionate to the scale of the event that you're doing. So, for most small festivals and events, the steps you need to take are quite straightforward. In the UK, we have the Health and Safety Executive, and they've got some useful downloads on their website, which I'm showing here. I think in Nigeria, your occupational safety and health is enforced through what's organised through the Federal Ministry of Labour. As an event organiser, you have a duty of care. That's to your audience, to your artists, and to your team. And what that means is that you need to take reasonable steps to prevent harm coming to those involved in your event. Now, reasonable steps, you don't have to do everything that's possible to do. You have to take reasonable steps. And that means you need to do a bit of forward planning in case of emergency situations. Now, clearly, the sort of emergencies that you're going to get in one part of Nigeria might be quite different from the sort of emergencies you get in another. Equally, the sort of emergency that we might face in Britain will be quite different from what you would consider an emergency. And clearly, there's an element of health and safety procedure that is also about our cultural preferences. But if something goes wrong at your festival, you need to think about what might be the consequences, not just for your festival, but also for yourself. So just take a moment and think about if there is an incident at your literature festival or at your dance festival or your music festival. What are the consequences for the festival? Might you lose money because ticket income goes down? Might you lose a sponsor because the sponsors pull out when they think that your event is not well managed? And then if something happens to a family friend, a child, one of your team, and you feel like you could have done more, how will you sleep at night? I'm going to talk to you today about risk assessment. because I think it's a tool that helps you plan what you want to do and do it safely, and it helps you sleep better at night. I'm sure some of you already do risk assessments as part of your everyday working practice, and you are probably really comfortable with that. So I'm going to talk this through from the perspective, if you know about risk assessment, maybe just use this as a little checklist, and if you don't, then think about these steps. In Britain, there's a sort of feeling amongst artists and arts people and culture workers that maybe risk assessment is a big, scary, bureaucratic process. It doesn't have to be. It's about being conscientious, and it's about applying common sense. Now, the interesting thing about common sense, it's not that common. So these steps that I'm going to take you through will act as a little reminder, or it's something you might share with your team, with your volunteers, just to help people get comfortable with this idea of risk assessment. You need to identify potential hazards for your festival. You need to assess the likelihood and the scale of the risks, and you need to take the necessary steps to protect yourself and others. In a nutshell, that's what risk assessment is. So, how do you identify hazards and take the steps? I would suggest that you begin by thinking about the suitability of the location. Whether you're planning an event in a club, in a theatre, in a field, or in a park on the edge of town, you still need to think about the suitability of that location. And by suitability, we're thinking about the suitability for your event. So write down the profile of your event. Make a written profile that says what activities will take place, what's the estimated audience size, and what's the demographic of that audience. Clearly, if you're putting on grime artist Stormzy in a park at the edge of your city, you will attract a really different audience than if you're planning to put on children's theatre in a small venue in your neighbourhood. So be specific when you're thinking through that audience. Who are your audience? Will it include children? Might elderly people come? How might there be disabled people within that audience? What will their needs be? Because that's all part of this profile. When you visit your location or your venue, and you're now about health and safety, the factors that you need to consider are capacity, access, existing hazards, what's there already that might be a hazard. So, once you've thought about those things, the capacity of your audience, the access needs of your audience, where are audience going to come in and where are they going to leave? The facilities on site, are there good toilets already? Are you going to need to bring toilets in? Once you've decided that that location is suitable, then you need to make a site plan. It's easy now with Google Images and Earth View and that sort of thing. You just have to draw out a site plan. If you're working with a venue, then they will probably already have a plan of the venue that you can use. And what you need to do on your site plan is work out where your stages are going to be, where your other structures are going to be, where your facility, where's the fencing going to stop access and egress, and where will the entrances and exits will be. So your site plan becomes part of your planning. Where's your first aid going to be located? Draw it on your site plan. And then make that plan available to people. So whether it's your suppliers or your artists or your volunteers, everyone gets a copy of it. And that helps people know where are they going to arrive. If they're unloading PA, where do they arrive? If they're bringing artists into a backstage area, where do they access that? And that's part of your health and safety planning. Then you need to carry out your risk assessment. You're thinking about the risks to safety that might be present at the event, and you're rating the level. So, is that really a big risk, or is it just quite a small risk? And number 5 is your severe risk, and number 1 is your. So just go through the risks and think about them. So I've given you here the areas that you might find your hazards. Use your team as well. If you often work with a technical manager or a production manager, this might be something that you do together. So you're thinking about crowd management. Hello to people that are just joining. This is a health and safety webinar. I'm Liz Pugh, and I can see that people are just still arriving into the room. We're thinking about health and safety for festivals. We're thinking about risk assessment, and at the moment, we're thinking really specifically about hazards. What are the issues around crowd management? Is there somewhere that people, as they access the park, might you get a crushing situation? Do you need to think about how to manage your crowd? Are you thinking about first aid? Do you have anyone on site? Do you have a first aider? Is there a first aid point? What happens in the event of bad weather? Might the ground become slippery? Might structures be affected by bad wind? Have you got hazards that are around cables, equipment, generators? From an environmental perspective, what are you thinking about in terms of the site? How are you dealing with wildlife? How are you dealing with rubbish? Is there a plan for after your festival so that you treat that environment with care and respect? Fire hazards. This is a really big deal and is probably one of the top of your list of things that might go wrong. Electrical equipment might catch fire. People cooking on open fires. If you've got food concessions and people are using open fires, or they've got gas canisters, that might be a risk or a hazard. Catering, I've mentioned food. Child protection. What are you going to do about lost children? If you invite people to your event, you have a duty of care, so you need to be thinking about these things. You want people to love your festival, and that means you've got to think about how you show that you love them, and thinking about their welfare, thinking about these things demonstrates that you are putting love and care into your work and into your audience. So really care about these things. When you're doing your risk assessment, you need to write down your significant risks. This isn't a game about imagining every possible risk. This is about thinking about significant risks and who is at risk. Think about your audience, your artists, your crew, your volunteers. I think someone's just joined and it's quite noisy. I don't know. Annika, if you're able to do anything about that, muting people. So think about how you're going to manage your risk. And what you want to be doing is placing extra focus on the most severe risks. So prioritize and timetable what you're doing about the risks that really matter to your festival. And remember that the way you approach this is also indicative of your overall good management of your festival. So taking this seriously is one of the ways that you can build credibility with funders, with investors, with sponsors. So what I want you to do now is just think about your own festival, your own event, and write down the top 3 hazard areas that you are going to give your focus to. What is it in your event or your festival that needs to be at the top of the list of priorities in terms of those hazard areas? I've given you some clues here. I don't know why there's purple lines on my presentation. It's a bit weird, but anyway, it looks like it's on my screen. So, crowd management hazards. You're thinking about overcrowding. What would you do if you had hostile behaviour? Is this the sort of event where people might get drunk and disorderly? That is often an issue in festivals in the UK. In my experience, my limited experience in Nigeria, that might not be such an issue. I'm sure you'll all correct me. Think about how you're going to manage traffic in relation to your audiences. First aid hazards. You know, if it's hot, are your dancers going to suffer from heat exhaustion because Calabar's having a heat wave? In bad weather, what are the hazards? What happens if equipment gets wet or overheated? And then thinking about your trip hazards, your fire hazards, your catering hazards. So of these, and I've listed them all there, what would be your 3 top hazards? That's where you need to put your energy first. If you haven't written it down now, then go back through this afterwards. We make the webinar available to you for up to the next 3 months. I can see that Diri has raised his or her hand. I hope that Annika is looking at that and will help with your query, because she's hosting. So this webinar is being hosted by Annika. As with so many things, collaboration is often key to success. So work with your team to think about how you're going to approach this. Work with your suppliers. Now, in the UK, we are well set up for risk assessments. All of your suppliers should have risk assessments for their stages or their AV equipment. That may not be the case in Nigeria yet, or some other places, but you can be part of creating a culture where you expect this level of professionalism with your partners. Where appropriate, you might need to involve the municipal authority or local emergency services. I've given here the website for the Health and Safety Executive in the UK. In the UK, we take health and safety really seriously. So some of the things that are on there may not be appropriate for the West African context. But for those of you, as I said before, for those of you that are working with partners from the UK, you might find that this gives you an idea of the sort of things that we are working with in the UK, and that might help you think things through. So, who is responsible for health and safety at your festival or your event? Is it you? Is it just you? Is it other people as well? Who will write the risk assessment for the festival? And if you have a number of different events happening in different locations, you might have your jungle party on the Saturday night, outdoors. You might have your discussion series at a local hotel, and you might have performances taking place at a new venue in the city centre. So you might need to be thinking through the health and safety needs for each of those different locations. But again, you go back and you write down, you know, your risk assessment process. You follow the steps. You also may need help with this. Could this be something that you delegate to someone else, a technical person, a production manager, or someone else in your team? Maybe one of your volunteers has experience of doing this sort of thing in their professional life. So find out who can do this for you and work with someone else. I find that as a festival director or as a producer, this isn't something I want to be doing on my own. I am often responsible for it, but I want to work with someone else who has a different view on things. So I might work with the production manager or the technical director to think about the risk assessment. You also might find you need to do a training session with your team or with your volunteers. I like to make health and safety something that everyone feels is their responsibility. And I think the more you can do that, the more you share the load and you anticipate problems before they become emergencies. So if you've got a team of volunteers who are noticing that that cable needs to be hung up, or we need to do something, we need to have better signage in that area of the festival because it's not clear to people where the entrance is and where the exit is. That means that that responsibility is being shared by your team, and I think you want to encourage that. I've given you here a sample risk assessment. This is really basic, but you know, and some of you will already be working with tools that are much more sophisticated than this as templates. But you need to be thinking about what are the hazards, who might be harmed, what are you already doing about that? Do you need to do anything else to control the risk? Who's doing it? When are they doing it? And then you need to record that it's been done. So, for example, If you're thinking about overcrowding at your main stage, who might be harmed? Your audience and your team, but particularly your audience. They might get crushed. What you're doing already is that you've booked 6 stewards who are going to manage that main stage arena. But hey, look, the ticket sales are going really well. We had imagined that the festival would be half full this year, but we can see that ticket sales are doing really well. So if we think that we need to get more stewards, book those stewards in good time. Who's going to do that? The festival manager. And when is that going to happen? It's going to happen 1 week before the festival. So you can go through your events and just think about those hazard areas and what you're going to do about them. Right, I can see that we've only got about 12 minutes left, and then there'll be an opportunity for questions. So those of you that are listening, if a question occurs to you, write it down, because there will be time for questions at the end. Emergency planning. Do you really need an emergency plan? What constitutes an emergency? When I was working with the last group of festival managers in West Africa back in March this year, we talked quite a lot about what constitutes an emergency. And I think in Nigeria, you have an amazing ability to deal with some things that in this country people would consider to be a major emergency. You see as just part of everyday life, and you get on and deal with it. So, you know, power failures in this country, in the UK, all of our infrastructure stops, our trains stop working, everybody panics when the power fails. In Nigeria, my observation was that power failures happen quite often and people just get on with it. So I'm aware that the whole notion of emergency planning depends on what you consider to be an emergency. But you might want to be thinking about, from your perspective and in relation to your event, what situations might happen that will require urgent action. If you're working with a venue, then they may well already have an emergency plan. So don't write one, theirs, have a look at it, and just check that you're happy with it and that you can work with that. You also might want to ask if they have one and work with them to create one. So what would you do if there was a fire in your festival club? What will you do if there's a stage collapse? What sort of bad weather might give you an emergency? And the idea is that you can develop an emergency plan that could be followed by any of your team, even if you're not there. Because of course these things always happen on the one occasion when, as the festival manager, you had to leave the site. That's when something goes wrong. So you need to be thinking about making sure your team are briefed and that they know what to do. Again, on a larger festival, if you're talking about festivals with thousands of people at them, then, and they're taking place in public space, then you need to liaise with your municipal authorities or your local emergency services. So talk to those people, and they may well be able to offer you advice and support. Gone very dark here, and I apologise for that. I don't know why. The sun is not out here in Salford, so I hope that that's okay. I've given you a checklist here of things to consider when you're thinking about those procedures. Who raises the alarm? Your team. Do you have a public address system so that you can communicate with the audience? A megaphone is fine. Maybe on the size of event that you have, actually it's just the stage manager will make an announcement that you need to evacuate the building. On big, excuse me, on big shows, big events, you might need a show stop procedure. If you were working, as we do, for example, if you were working with fireworks in a city centre and something happened, then you would need to know what is your show stop procedure and how do you start it all again. You know, if you have to stop the main stage, what's the plan? Do you have the ability to deal with an emergency on site? Do you have some fire extinguishers? Do you have security staff? And who will summon emergency services if indeed they exist? And I'm aware that sometimes those in smaller areas, in rural areas, those things may not exist easily. Think about your crowd management. How would you move people away to a place of safety? If you needed to bring a fire engine on site, is there a clear route through to the main stage? How will you provide first aid? I would suggest that before your festival happens, at that time when you're getting really, really busy, still you need to make time to talk through your emergency plans in the event of the most likely risks taking place. So get your team together, and whether that's volunteers or your technical team, your stage management team, your production team, whoever it is, get them in the room. And hey, if you're doing a small event and it's just with your friends, still get them together and talk through your risk assessment, your plan. If there was a fire in the main tent, what would we do? If the main act fails to turn up because the traffic in Lagos was so bad that they couldn't get from the airport to the site, then the crowd are getting restless. What do we do at that point? Who's making the announcement? Do we have a microphone ready to do that? These sort of things, if you talk them through with your team in advance, then means if anything goes wrong, and I'm sure that as festival managers, nothing will go wrong because you know what you're up to, then everything's under control. Implementing health and safety. This is about your responsibilities to manage your team, your artists, your audience, all the way through. So you're thinking about the festival from the very start to the very end. What happens on site before the audience arrive and once the audience is as important. You've still got crew working at 2 o'clock in the morning, even though the audience went home at 11 o'clock at night. So what happens when people get tired is that, you know, accidents are more likely to happen. So look at looking at, does that stage really need to be de-rigged that night? What about paying for night security and having your team come in and do it the next day? That might be safer. One of the things that I think you need to do as festival managers is think about the safety of your artists. I think artists want to go where they feel loved. So if your festival is working with people and you get a great reputation for really looking after your artists, and they feel safe. They will talk to their friends in the industry. So you want to make sure that people want to come to your festival, not just audiences, but also great artists. And if the reputation goes out that you look after people, then you might be able to do a good deal with that artist. You might be able to get them a bit cheaper because they know that they're going to be made to feel safe and made to feel looked after. I think you need to do a site induction with your suppliers. So if you're managing a festival site, and it might just be, you know, a car park that you've built a stage in and you're doing something for one weekend, still, you need to be telling your team, this is how we make this work. This is where the exits are. This is where the first aid is, and that's where the toilets are. Show them the site plan that I talked about earlier in the webinar. You also might want to provide information to the public. Personally, I would keep that to a minimum. You know, if you walk onto a site and you get bombarded with health and safety information, that doesn't really, for me, that doesn't work. But you might have to have some minimal stuff that helps your audience feel safe. Think about how you create a positive health and safety culture in your team. Monitor the risk. Somebody's just, I think it's gone a bit noisy there. Monitor risks, have a checklist, do a walk round at different points during the festival. If it's a 3-day dance festival, make sure that somebody is going and having a look round each day of your festival. So don't just open the doors to the audience and then go, brilliant, we've got that sorted. What about the next day? What about 2 hours later? What about the Sunday? Responsibility for health and safety as part of their contribution to the success of your festival. So make it your team's responsibility. Encourage people to feel like it's something to do with them. It's not just your responsibility or the production manager's responsibility. And what you will find is that the bits of paper that I suggested you write, you know, at the beginning I said, write down the profile of your event, write your risk assessment. Those bits of paper, it might be on, you know, obviously on your computer, they are evidence that you have taken reasonable steps. And you may find that sponsors or funders, those people who want to invest in your event, expect to see that sort of documentation. And if you don't have time to do it, delegate that task to someone else. Can they, you know, put together all of the risk assessments in one folder and make sure you have it on site? You need to evaluate and review the process. So think about how you're going to improve your festival each year. Once the event is finished, and obviously I'm talking about events that, I'm talking mainly about events that take place outdoors or in public space. This is the same whether, you know, if you've hired a room in a hotel or somebody else's venue, still, have you left it clear and safe? When you do your debrief with your team, with the venue, with your sponsors, with your investors, with your partners, ask them about safety. You know, did anyone notice anything? Are there any lessons to learn? Could you have done something better? What changes and what actions are you going to put into place to make next year's festival better than this year's? And remember, you can only do what you can do, but do make sure you do it well. You know, it may be better to do a smaller event that is more comfortable for everyone involved, and that's you, your team, your volunteers, your partners, and your audience, than to try and do, you know, something massive without quite enough time, without quite enough money, without quite enough people. So do something that's achievable and do it really well. And if you think you are doing it well, then shout about your success. You know, mention it on your company website, mention it on your festival website that you have a commitment to this area. And I would really suggest that you mention it in any sponsorship proposal. You know, you couldn't say, the person responsible for health and safety in our organisation is this person, and they will be dealing with all aspects of the festival. They will be looking at the risk assessments. They'll be working for me, the festival director, on this area. I know we're getting to question time, and I'm sure some of you have got really specific questions. Let me just final 2 slides. Do you need support? If you're working with a UK partner, then you need to expect a higher level of scrutiny and more focus on this area. So, for example, visiting tour managers for bands, production managers from touring companies, if they're from the UK, they will expect you to have undertaken a risk assessment, and they will expect to get a copy of that in advance. If you're working with a venue and you want to put on brilliant UK hip hop artist, the tour manager will ask to see the venue's risk assessment. And if that venue doesn't have one, you can help create that. Use the steps from this webinar and work it through. You can also ask your partners to share knowledge and expertise. You all have the best knowledge of your local from the UK for your festival. Then you can reassure that tour manager or that company stage manager that you understand what their concerns are and that you are doing what you can to mitigate the risks. You've got a technical manager, these sort of things. And you can also tell them that actually it's not appropriate for the local context in Nigeria to have a safety advisory group meeting once a week in the 6 weeks running up to the festival. That doesn't happen. In the UK, it might do. So share your expertise, and if you're working, it's not just working between UK and West Africa. Obviously, the conditions and the expectations will be different between Ghana and Zimbabwe, between Uganda and Nigeria. So share expertise, work with each other, and as festival managers in Nigeria, think about who's doing something similar to what you're doing in another part of the country. Might they be willing to share their template, their risk assessment, their plan? And be willing to share yours. You know, this stuff only works if we're a bit generous about this sort of expertise. And I think as you're working in the arts, you've already chosen to work in a way that is about prioritizing values that are around cooperation, collaboration, and I hope generosity. I've given a little checklist of resources. Some of these are UK specific. As I mentioned before, we, the festival managers who did the British Council training in Lagos back in March, we created an event management plan template, and some of that is useful when you're thinking about health and safety. It was interrogated by 40 different festival directors covering film festivals, dance festivals, traditional cultural festivals, the fishing festival, the Durbas. So it's had a really good interrogation in terms of what's appropriate in a West African context. So I know that British Council can have a copy of that plan and can share that. And I'll talk with Annika to make sure that we've got that plan up to date. So, whoops, there's the end. If people have questions, now might be a good time for questions. So maybe Annika can pass over those questions while I try and work out where the chat box has gone. Hi, Annika.
Yes, can you hear me? Hello?
I can, yes.
Okay, great.
I can't see the chat box, so if you just want to share the question and I'll try and answer it.
Yes, so there's a question from Nick. He says, with regards to collaborations with government agencies, can LASEMA and NEMA be incorporated in the event planning to forestall unforeseen circumstances? So, can you hear me? Hello? Hello?
You went a bit wobbly. Hello, you went a bit wobbly. Can you just repeat the question again?
Okay, so with regards to collaborations with government agencies, can LASEMA and NEMA be incorporated in the event planning to forestall unforeseen circumstances?
Can what be incorporated?
LASEMA and NEMA. So these are like emergency. They are emergency agencies, basically.
And if they are your Nigerian local, if they're emergency agencies in Nigeria, I think that you should be having a conversation at an early age from there, depending on the scale of your event. So find out, if it's a small event for 250 people, I imagine there will be a different level of scrutiny and expectation if you're planning a music festival for 25,000 people. So you need to ask what level of event they're interested. Send them the profile of your event with your expected activities and your audience profile and your capacity, and then ask them, what level of interest will they have? Do they want one meeting with you? Do they want a copy of your plan? What do they need?
Okay, there's a comment from Chioma. So she says, for collaborations, I think religious institutions and schools should be included in trainings as they are currently event drivers in Nigeria.
That's a really good point. And I suppose my observation would be that they might well also be really good partners. From my experience, the technical equipment available in churches is often better than the technical equipment available in some of the public buildings. So you may well want to work with churches and religious institutions. And I think your point about including those people in your planning is a really good one. Yes, let's see how we can share this sort of expertise widely. And for those of you that are linked in and making events happen in your own churches, then be thinking about how you can pass this on. As any of you that have met me, I'm passionate about this idea of cascading the expertise through your team. So whether that's colleagues that you work with, or up or down, it might be, your boss or the people that are working for you. Think about how you can share this, because it's about creating that sense of shared responsibility. So thank you for that point. Really good point.
Another question from Rachel. She says, can you kindly give some more tips on crowd control?
Probably not, because I think crowd control is something that needs to be really specific to the location and the activities. There is a lot of people who are experts in crowd management. I'm not one of them, but I do think that we go back to that idea of common sense. If you are looking at your entrances and exits, and you can see that the only way in or out of that room or that venue is a small door the size of one person, then you clearly have got an issue if you've got 700 people trying to leave that venue in an emergency. And I suppose when you think about some of the stories that we hear from around the world of things going wrong, fire is obviously a big issue. So you might need to be thinking about where are your entrances and exits for ticketing, but also in the case of an emergency. You might want to be checking that those emergency exits are unlocked. So if you're working in someone else's venue, go round, open fire doors, check the emergency exits, because you don't want to hire a venue and maybe it's the Sheraton Hotel in Abuja and you're paying a lot of money for that room, but somebody forgot to unlock the fire door in the corridor. So just do that sort of thing. I mean, obviously, if you're paying for, the hotel, a respectable hotel, you would hope that you don't need to worry about that. I think crowd management is best done by communicating positive messages rather than panic. So I would say, think about how your volunteers might be briefed to support your crowd management. If what you need is people to arrive by one route but leave by another, place volunteers at those entrances and exits. If you're thinking about moving people from a car park to a venue, then make sure that you have people with, a high-vis jacket at the exit to the car park who are directing people. Personally, I would go for friendly, well-informed staff or volunteers as your main crowd management tools, rather than hundreds of paid staff who haven't been well briefed. But it depends on your budget, it depends on your location, and it depends on what's already there. So I hope that helps you.
There's a question from Emmanuel Olukoto, but I think that's for another webinar, not this one. So his question is about getting a loan to facilitate a festival. And Liz will be taking another session on fundraising, on another webinar on fundraising. So best to join then and have this question then.
Yeah. Yes, I think the next two webinars, one is, they're in September. Annika will send the details out, sign up for that. But yeah, I'm not gonna cover fundraising or sponsorship in this webinar. It's very much thinking about health and safety. So hold on, let's do, so do we have any more questions?
No, that's everything.
Hello, can
That's
you hear
everything.
me?
Can you hear me?
Okay. In which case, I'm going to say thank you all very much for your time, and I hope that you found it useful. If you want to, give any feedback to Annika about things that you felt didn't have work or that have worked, share it in the chat room. That's really useful. If you feel that I went too fast or too slow through the points, then give that feedback. And I use Twitter to share professional. After the evaluation session, the last time, I posted a couple of things on my Twitter feed. And my Twitter feed, I should have written it down. I'll see if I can just put it onto, whoops, hang on. I'll just see if I can put it onto this slide. Hold on. I don't think I can. Let me see. No, it's at Liz Pugh, but Liz is spelt with an S. LISPUGH. So keep an eye on that Twitter feed, and I will try and post some stuff about health and safety over the next few days. For those of you that missed the beginning, the webinar will be available in the next couple of months, certainly till the end of September. So take time to go back through it, refresh, go through it more slowly. Remember what I said. Answer the questions. I've put the questions in green. And thank you all very much for your time. I'll see you in September. Goodbye.